The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to today's webinar, Hired on IQ, but EQ gets you promoted, demoted or removed, with guest speaker Stephen Hanman. This webinar will provide an overview of the process of developing a high-performance team, supply chain organisation and the value it delivers. How to apply the diagnostic of the mirror-extended Tuckman phases of the team development that include forming, storming, norming, maturing, customising and innovating. And understand where your team currently is and what actions and activities can move the team up the development curve towards high performance. This will be an interactive webinar and Stephen will be asking questions throughout the webinar. I'm now going to put you on to Stephen.
Thank you, Wendy. And welcome to those people here. As Wendy said, we're going to talk a little bit about high-performing teams and the development of those, in addition to the use of emotional intelligence and how that interacts with high-performing teams. And the first thing I'd like to do is change, if I could ask you just to let me know one of your expectations of attending today. So just one, and what I will promise is that if you tell me what your expectation is, I'll directly address that during this session. And I suppose one of my objectives is to be able to satisfy your specific interest about this topic, but also it lets me know that I'm not just a robot. So if you could respond, that would be really appreciated, and Wendy will check in through the session and I'll get some of that feedback from you. So moving on, this is one of three in webinars, and it's sort of part of what I'm calling Supply Chain 2020, which is just what I believe will become the norm, and that is that supply chains will become seamless in that the silos will start to be removed and they'll be collaborative within organisations and also across organisations, and that will become possible if they're driven by high-performing emotional teams. And the idea here is that interdependency will become the key driver, and that contrasts with independence, which is the main driver in most for organisational life, in that you look after your department or area rather than looking at the broader system or value chain. So that will be the transition. It's already happening in industry in a range of ways. So that's what will become. So what we've already done in the first webinar was talk about this concept of a seamless supply chain. And today we're talking about high-performing teams and the use of multiple intelligences, but specifically emotional intelligence today. And the third webinar that I'm running is this idea of partnering with a 3PL, so the idea of using a partnering model and developing up a relationship whereby value is delivered to both organisations at a strategic level. So let's sort of move into today then, which is about a high-performing team. Some or all of you will remember the Tuckman research, which was from the 1950s, 60s, and that was forming, storming, norming and performing. Myself and another colleague, David Lignitzi, just looked at that performing aspect and added maturing, customising and innovating, because it gave more depth to the idea of how teams develop into high-performing teams. Then we'll look at emotional intelligence and its role in high-performance teams. And then we'll look at the 12 emotional competencies that are broken up into that self-awareness, self-management, social awareness and relationship management, which are the 4 aspects of emotional intelligence. Interestingly, my experience is they're far more business related than everybody thinks. For example, one of the key competencies is achievement orientation. I might just check in, Wendy, in terms of whether there's any expectations that have popped up.
Yep, I do. I have one from Mark Birkinshaw. He's looking for top tips.
Top tips. Okay. Well, one of them is, I suppose, that to my surprise, emotional intelligence is very much related to business performance, and you'll see there achievement orientation is one of the competencies that is measured in the Hay Group ESCI process, which I'm accredited in, and I've done that with high performance teams, and that's the first thing you want as a strength in any team, that they deliver what they promise they're going to deliver. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. So let's then move on to high performing teams, and the idea here is that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Now that means that if we add up the independent capacity of each of those sections or parts or silos or departments, they will be less than if everybody works together as a whole. And you can see this in many aspects of life, sport, in an orchestra, and in an organisation where silos do not predominate, but this flow is actually created. So from a strategic intent, we want to move from a pleasant and polite group of people who are delivering good supply chain functional outcomes, and in that environment independence reigns. And the idea is what we're wanting to move to is an environment where people are far more connected. So rather than independent, they're now connected, and they're delivering end-to-end outcomes in the supply chain, focused on a targeted service level and a targeted cost level that enables them to be at that leading edge. And in that environment where people are working with interdependence, they can also innovate, and it's also far more sustainable than just working in your silo. So as I said, interdependence is what's the norm here. And invariably what also happens is people have a great time doing it because the whole self can turn up in this interdependency. So it's a whole system, living system, in contrast to the sort of metaphor of the machine, which is in that from space, which is far more mechanistic. So let's just go to one piece of research, and Lencioni gives these 5 elements in their negative construct, and I've just given it in the positive construct. So you might just consider these, pick a team that you're involved in, you lead, or that you're part of, and just score yourself out of 100 for each of these. So the first one is a high trust environment, and I believe that high trust is created when we build certainty amongst people and team members, and that's created if we live by the value or principle or behaviour that we do what we say. That means that people become their word. So certainty equals keeping promises, and when you keep promises you build trust, and that's a critical part to building a high performing team. So the idea is that transparency actually builds trust. So you in your roles consider where you can be more transparent with people in all walks of life, because in being more transparent it builds trust. The significance about trust is that trust enables people to start caring for each other, and what that means is that they can step into each other's shoes, and so therefore interdependence starts to be created and high performance starts to flow in that environment, and so loyalty becomes just the norm in this high trust environment. Significantly, high trust environments mean people are interested in their weaknesses as well as their strengths, and that's a significant step, because normally showing any weakness would be a career limiting move. In these high performing teams we stop kidding ourselves and we embrace the idea that everybody's got strengths and weaknesses. So that's another sort of top tip, that high trust, high performing teams, we've got to work with our weaknesses, and we've got to have respect for each other and trust for each other, that they can be put on the table respectfully and it won't be used against you. So it does demand a certain type of leadership. So the second aspect, so mark yourself for high trust environment out of 100, where 100 is high trust and 0 is none. The second one is having the ability to deal with conflict. And in my work, what I do is build the capability to fight fair. And what that's talking about is enabling robust and rigorous conversation where we stop sweeping things under the carpet. We build a capability to name issues. And the top tip here is name it to tame it. Okay, so once it's discussed, it tends to settle down. So the focus on any type of conflict work that you're involved in is that you focus on the issue and not the person, and it will lead you to be able to resolve conflict in a better way than you might if you're person focused. Of course, people are always in it, but the issue is what we need to deal with. So number 3, we're talking about levels of commitment, and we're talking about the engagement of the whole person. So you might call that head, heart and hands. You might call that professional and also personal. And the idea being that together everybody achieves more. That's the whole concept of high performing teams, that the whole can achieve greater than the sum of the parts. So commitment is certainly one. The fourth one is accountable. So understanding that you make a promise, and if you make that promise, you keep it. Okay, so it's about clarity of expectation and about self-responsibility. And in an environment where everybody is self-responsible, we don't need the manager looking over people's backs, because everybody trusts that yes means yes. And if I don't deliver, I will be held account in a peer pressure environment rather than a one-on-one only. So the last one is attention to results, which is once again also linked to this emotional intelligence concept of achievement orientation. So we know what success looks like, we share it amongst the team, and what we do is monitor and share that journey, and visibility is important, and as we mentioned before, transparency builds trust. So they're the 5 things. Mark yourself out of 100 for each of those 5, and you'll have a sense of where you might think you are in that high-performing team. And obviously, depending on your role in the team, if you're the leader, you might think it's better than it really is. That's why it's important to bring other people in so people can tell you what it's like there. So moving on to the work I do in terms of high-performance teams, I've broken this picture up into these 7 steps, and those 7 steps start with strategic intent. So that means that make a statement about what you're wanting to create and be really clear about what success looks like. Part of that picture is building high trust relationships, which we've just spoken about. There will always be learning and development by individual people. It might start with the leader, but it will always belong to everybody in the team. There's a need to start focusing on cross-functional, which means rather than me just being interested in my success, I start to be interested in cross-functional or seamless effectiveness, which is the ability to deliver on what you've promised. Always there's a team dynamics coaching, and the high-performing teams that we're going to talk about is part of it. And then team leadership, which is critical because the leader needs to share leadership in a high-performance team. So another top tip is if you can't share leadership, then you're not going to get very far in the context of a high-performing team. So what I've done there is then describe the outcomes or results if you get it right. So all those things on the right-hand side are the outcomes of a high-performing team. It's a pretty resounding picture, one where everyone is better off and everyone's their best, and that team's the best, which is also the best for the organisation. So it is worth it, and it's worth the effort to move into that space. So then I've just gone through and given you a little bit more detail about each one of those 7 aspects. And perhaps going back to that last one, point 7, the concept of expertise outranking rank. And that actually involves that the hierarchy and the rank that people have should not be the most important thing. There should be a level of equality in that team. So once again, if that leader isn't able to share leadership and see people as equals, the idea being that we're all equals as human beings, and so at a values and behaviours level, everybody is equal no matter what rank they have in the organisation. Obviously that's not the norm, but in the high performing organisations, high trust relationships, equality is a critical aspect. So moving on, I've just given you a picture that if you want to embrace this idea, this 7-step process that I use, and I'll leave you to contemplate that, and they're the steps that I've undertaken, and I've given you a little bit more of an expansion. So most of you will know the forming, storming, norming. What we've added is this maturing, so the encounter, the conscious development of trust, and this need for openness, cooperation, collaboration is the maturing one. So we start to see ourselves as connected to each other. We need to get connected, and you need to run through a process where you nurture relationship and connectedness in that 4th step. So the 5th stage is this customising, and the idea is that now we're a mature group of people all seeing how each of us needs to be successful, and we're all dependent on each other in that terms of interdependence. We need to make sure that we're focused as a team on what the customers really want, not what we think they want, but what they really want. And then the last phase in that development is innovating, and that creates a demand for leadership whereby we trust that each individual knows what's best in their area of expertise to nurture. And so they're actually given an open mandate by the team and by the leader to pursue what they believe is important. So it's a very developed phase of high-performing team. Rare to see it, but for those people who have experienced it, they'll have a sense of what I'm talking about. So let me give one example of an example of a high-performing, or of the development of a high-performing team. So this is an example of a team that I worked with, and you can see the current scores. So if people are interested, send an email to Wendy, and I can send you a copy of the diagnostic that we've developed, and you can use that. So if anybody's interested, please do that. You can see here that the team, 13 for forming, 10 for storming, 15 norming, maturing, customising, innovating. So what this highlights is that really the team is not embedded in any one stage of development yet. They're all over the place. And you know, if a team has got a score of 19 to 25 in any one phase, then it indicates that's the predominant phase that the organisation's in. So what we need to do here, or what my challenge was, is to reduce the forming, perhaps increase the storming, because that means the people aren't saying what they need to say, reduce some of the norming, which are the rules that are bound, and for example, one of them might be to introduce the idea of speaking more. If you don't agree, say it. Don't just be silent because it's the boss. And that's where some of this maturity of the leader needs to be incorporated into this philosophy. So what this group was a high-performing group of individuals at its early phase, and what I did initially was to develop some strategic intent and some leadership development as explained a couple of slides ago. I suggested they were probably in the norming phase, which means that they need to let go of those rules as I mentioned. The leader needs to be open about sharing leadership, and that's exactly the question I asked. So that's a really big step for a leader to be capable of letting go and what I would say get out of the centre of the circle so someone else can step in. So it takes a certain amount of courage, and it takes a certain number of steps in the development of trust amongst the team for the leader to do that. But the leader needs to appreciate that they as a team will achieve more if that leader can get out of the centre and let someone else lead in areas that they're the expert. So the procurement person may be better off leading the procurement conversation, not the supply chain leader, for example. Same for distribution, same for planning, same for customer service. So this was a process I worked on for a couple of years, and I did a number of interventions, and then we redid the team development survey, and you can see these updated results that the forming went down, the storming did increase a bit, the norming went down a little bit, and we had increases in maturing, customising and innovating. And just to give you a picture, the first thing we did was introduce a value or a behaviour that said we need to be open and honest, and that meant that no one could be silent when they didn't agree anymore. Each one of these people did their emotional intelligence, which meant they got feedback from each other. It was a 360-degree process, and they more importantly presented to each other about what they were going to work on into the future, and they held each other accountable for that focus. So, you know, one person, for example, said they were going to be more open and honest when they didn't agree, and they started to have more robust conversations with people. So everybody knew when they agreed and when they didn't agree. The other thing that the team did was they started to have a stand-up meeting once a week, and that had it sounds simple, but it had an enormous impact on everyone because they started to understand each other's objectives and then understand how they impact on each other. And so the interdependencies started to be present, visible, aware, and so then people had the choice to make whether they wanted to act out those interdependencies. You can't act them out if you don't see them. So meeting weekly was a big step. And in that process, what that team decided to do was develop what they called a seamless supply chain, and the idea of no silos, which is very challenging because it means each of these people in each of their functional areas was being invited to play across the whole supply chain or value chain. And I'm sure everyone can sit there and think about the challenges that that demands, because everyone needs to take into account other people's styles and histrionics in terms of how they lead. So forming reduced, a bit more storming, more importantly maturing started to increase and people started to see each other. That allowed all sorts of opportunities inside that group of people. That was then experienced by everyone who came in contact with this group of people. So a very positive, challenging environment, but everyone was better off afterwards. And one of the other aspects is this development of emotional intelligence that people took on, and it's all about seeing the other. So to the sort of phrase that we use, hiring, people get hired predominantly on IQ, but EQ gets you promoted, demoted or removed. Just as a point of reference for anyone, they want to go, I've got a book that I published that talks about the development of a high performance workplace in the construction, design and construction industry. So if you go to collaborativeinquiry.com, you can download that book from me to We Design and Build Collaborative Workplaces free of charge. And if you look at page 55 on that book, you can see the different leadership styles that we nurtured in that project, similar to what I've just been speaking about in the last few minutes about a high-performing team environment. So let's move on then to emotional intelligence, which is part of the development of a high-performing team. And the thing about emotional intelligence, unlike IQ, is that you can learn it. Research tells us that we peak at about 28, but then we can continue to develop our emotional intelligence through our experience and wisdom. And the idea of emotional intelligence is that it allows people to be their best, and it allows people to maintain a capability even when it's high stress, because we become aware of the impact of the consequences of our actions through the development of our own emotional intelligence. So it makes us as individuals more efficient, productive, successful, there's less misunderstanding. It means that we can create these high trust relationships where interactions can just flow because there's an understanding. We've done some upfront work on relationships, and that upfront work allows us to move into a flow that if you don't do the work, conflict stops us from getting to those points, stops us from innovating in the full potential that's possible. Certainly one of the aspects is emotional intelligence allows us to become more real and actually resolve differences in a healthy way so they don't stop the organisation in the future. So most of my work around change and organisations is I need to open Pandora's box and deal with unresolved issues before I can help an organisation transform in whatever area, whether it's an IT application or whether cultural, whether values and behaviours, or whether a seamless supply chain. You need to deal with the past in a way that allows things to flow in the future. If it doesn't affect what's going on in the future, you leave it in the past. So very important to help people to maximise. The idea is that people see themselves in a development mode always, and they're always getting better. So, you know, human beings make mistakes. We're not saying we're going for perfection, but what we're going for is a reflective position on a daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly basis where we reflect on how we're going as a group of people, how we're going as individuals, based on the promises we've made to others. So emotional intelligence is a critical component of a high-performance team. So many years ago, Aristotle said anyone can become angry. That's the easy bit. But to be angry with the right person to the right degree at the right time for the right purpose and in the right way, that's not easy. And we can spend our lives getting better at it. But that's how we can define in an easy way emotional intelligence. So if we then break it down into those 4 pieces that I've spoken about: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship management. And what relationship management and our improved capability there has an impact on everybody. It can actually then enable high performance because everybody can work day to day staying engaged, and discretionary effort is always available in that high performing environment, and that's the challenge. It's the same challenge with engagement. We're not looking for engagement for the sake of it, we're looking for it because discretionary effort is then possible in that environment, and that's where the magic happens. So the good news is we can increase our emotional intelligence, and I've seen dramatic improvements in people with this focus. So emotions, thoughts, behaviours actually lead to improved performance, and so sometimes, you know, so in one of these emotional intelligence competencies is emotional self-control, and often what you see is that emotional self-control is too much. People are unemotional, and emotional intelligence does not equal not being emotional. It's being appropriate, and it's being aware of when your buttons get pushed. So part of the Hay Group research is that leadership styles, which can predominantly be determined by emotional intelligence, have a 70% impact on organisational climate or culture, and that has a 30% impact on business performance, which I think many would argue it could be much higher than that. Okay, so the idea of emotional intelligence is that we can pick up what leadership style is important in the moment, and we're flexible and agile in the delivery of that style. What that means is that we don't use an inappropriate style like command and control when we're trying to develop up, for example, a high-performance team. So the good news is it's learnable. So great leaders bring out the best in their team members, and they do that through their own capability in emotional intelligence by being able to read the signs and signals. And great leaders, they may have done nothing on the development of their emotional intelligence, but they're highly emotionally intelligent, and their past will uncover various means to achieve that intelligence. So if we look at some of the research in terms of the links between EQ and performance, we can see that those leaders demonstrating high emotional self-awareness, so that's the first emotional competency. So it's the ability to know what I feel, to be able to articulate what I feel, and to not be triggered into a certain action for the sake of the trigger. I can actually park the trigger and still deliver the leadership style that's necessary to maximise output in whatever interaction is required. So high emotional self-awareness, 92% create positive climates. Only 8% had a neutral impact and none were creating demotivating. And in sharp contrast, 78% of the leaders who demonstrated low self-awareness created negative workplace climates. So direct link between emotional intelligence and organisational culture. Probably not a surprise to those who have that level of emotional intelligence. Excuse me. So here we've just listed the 12 competencies. As I said, I mentioned achievement orientation. And one of the challenges, and mindfulness is part of this picture as well. In terms of, on the right-hand side there, I talk about the monkey mind, the blah, blah, blah. Emotionally intelligent people can switch off the mind and consider the right next step, okay? An example of some emotional intelligence work I've done with an organisation and groups within that. And down the bottom there you can see an environment where the team emotional intelligence has been documented. So the idea is that you need at least 3 strengths, and a strength was something that you do almost all the time if you were to complete the Hay Group ESCI survey. And it's a relatively cheap process. It's about $2,000 per person to complete your emotional intelligence. So in this environment, it was very clear that what the task was to develop up the team capabilities in procurement planning, and even more significantly in the supply chain leadership group. And you can see that the team had no strengths measured this way, nor did customer service. So a significant development opportunity if the organisation and the group had the courage to take it on. So here's just another example of the team report, and it lists in the blue you consistently demonstrate that, so that's the equivalent score of 4.3, so that's a strength. So in this environment, this team had 1 strength, which is achievement orientation, which is a great competency to have, because that means they deliver on what they promise. And it may well be that if they now develop up their teamwork, which is that last one, it may well be that they embed their achievement orientation culture into a team-based environment, for example, and so on. You can see there no inspirational leadership. So that team, obviously we could work specifically with inspirational leadership in that environment. So let's go back to the research says emotional self-awareness is the most important competency, and if you improve your own emotional self-awareness, every other emotional competency, the other 11, will be improved. So the challenge is to know yourself, to understand what actually drives you, understand where your beliefs come from, what you value and what your goals are, and create a conversation in the broader group or team about this conversation, about what's really important. You know, of course we need money to live, but most of us can go and work in many places, so why do we choose to work where we work? What is it that's critical? Let's name that, make it very conscious to the team, and let's look after those deeper reasons that we find ourselves together. On the bottom there I've given a continuum. Emotional self-awareness, we're not talking about excessive emotional expression, bursting into tears. we're not talking about being inhuman or like machines. What we're looking for here is this middle ground of being emotionally self-aware. I can actually articulate what I feel. I can articulate it in such a way that everyone understands it. I can respond appropriately when someone else is emotional or shows some emotion, whether that be in an environment where they're sick or they have a family member who's sick or there's been a death in the family or the like. So that's the challenge. So one example of improving your own emotional self-awareness is to consider yourself. So you're all sitting somewhere with a computer, I presume, and there's an outer zone, which is the environment and the sights and the sounds and the smells and the texture. So, for example, I can hear rain falling on my tin roof and it's cloudy and I can hear birds in the background. So for everyone else, what is it that they can pick up in their outer zone? Then we go to the middle zone, and this is all happening together. There's a middle zone where we're thinking and our beliefs are coming out and we've got self-talk. And so some of the things I've said may have pushed your button, or some of them may be you're saying yes to. So that's the middle zone in terms of your thinking and beliefs. And then there's also an inner zone for each of us, and we can express that inner zone by what our breathing's doing and whether we have bodily sensations which could be linked to the outer zone or the middle zone. So if someone thinks that what I've said makes no sense at all, they'll feel angry, they'll feel hot, they'll feel frustrated, you know. There'll be lots of things going on whereby it represents an inner zone. So in the development of emotional self-awareness, we're trying to develop the inner zone, the middle zone and the outer zone, and people who are emotionally self-aware are aware of those three things all the time. So let me just summarise then. We've spoken about emotional intelligence and its role in a high-performing team. We've spoken about the different phases in a high-performing team, and that Tuckman model, it's expanded. If people want a copy of that survey, please give me a yell. If anybody wants any information about the emotional intelligence, I've got a generic report I can send people. We've spoken about the 12 competencies and provided a focus on achievement orientation. And I hope that gives people an introduction to emotional intelligence and the links with high-performing team. And just briefly, as I mentioned, the third webinar is about collaborative relationships between strategic suppliers and customers and looking at partnering. So thank you, Wendy. Any questions, please?
No, there is no questions. Oh, hang on a sec. Oh, my goodness. I just got inundated. I've got one from Lawrence Norton. I can't read the top of it, Lawrence. Hang on. There is an increasing rate of challenges and changes brought about by spread of international processes and standards. Boards, when presented with strategies that include major change to staff leadership, first tend to ask, show me the money, without being cynical. Is money the only reliable start point and or common base point?
So personally, I don't think money's obviously critical because success is measured in money, but there are many, many examples where money is looked after if, for example, a high trust environment, you know, culture can deliver better outcomes, and most of us will know that. So sometimes there is a leap of faith. So I used to run a benchmarking business, and people used to say to me, well, what will I get out of benchmarking? And I used to say, I can't tell you that, but what I'll tell you is that when you get it, let me know. Okay, so there are leaps of faith that we take, and this is an example of that because leadership style is an important, you know, so that all the research tells us that leadership style impacts on climate and climate impacts on performance, and you can find research all over the place. And this global movement about mindfulness is one example of it. And, you know, money needs to be an important aspect, but not the only one, because it doesn't tell much about sustainability. I might make high profit today, but if I've burnt all my customers, I'm not going to make a profit tomorrow. So how we do it is critical to long-term sustainable success.
Can you tell me, Lawrence, does that answer your question? Yeah, it does answer the question. Has anybody else got any questions? No, not at this stage. Look, a big thank you to you again, Stephen, for redoing this webinar, as I know that you did it about a week ago, but we're inundated with people asking for you to redo it. We look forward to all of you joining us again on Friday the 16th of the 9th, delivering a value of high performance team, again with Stephen Henman. If you have any further questions, please do not hesitate to call me and I'll pass them on for you. A short survey will appear on the completion of this webinar. Thank you in advance to all of those that take time to complete it. If you have any ideas for future webinars, topics and speakers, please let me know, and have a great rest of the week. Thank you again for attending.
Thank you.